Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to our first What the Lit Read Book Club author chat. Whether you're a part of our in-person group or our online group with Geneva, or I know some people have just seen me through my book account, I'm really glad that you're here today. And I'm really excited to talk about our April pick with the author himself, Andrew Boryga. And I just want to encourage everyone that throughout the chat, if they have any questions, feel free to send them into the Pacific Q&A group. But regardless, I have some questions queued up for you, and I'm going to make it as interactive as possible by including polls to have throughout. So I'm really excited to be able
Cool.
to, yeah, I'm really excited to see how people feel about certain questions that we'll have, but it'll be easier to track if people put it in the Q&A section. Since there's so much to talk about with this story. So, Andrew, this is fortunately not our first time meeting, which is great. We met at your
No.
book event.
Yes, yes.
But I'm really excited to be able to have like a really in-depth conversation with you. You know how much I loved your book. I feel like
All right,
anyone
good.
who's talked to me for the past 3 months knows about it. So I've been sitting with it for quite some time, and I have, some few questions that I'm really excited to get your insights on. In our in-person meeting, there are some really great feedback and thoughts that I've also included in there. So I'm just curious to see how you feel. And
Sure,
so before we get into like the big concepts and,
sure.
talking points of the books, I kind of want to start with the epigraph. So actually a bunch of people called it out, which I'm glad that it stood out to people. It was honestly a really great quote and selection. I think, epigraphs really can help shape readers' and expectations for the book and kind of
Mhm.
give them an insight for how the journey ahead is going to be. And you selected a quote by, one of the greats, James Baldwin, which I'll just repeat for anyone who might not remember. It says, perhaps the turning point in one's life is realizing that to be treated like a victim is not necessarily to become one. So I've always been curious about the process of choosing an epigraph. Is it something that you've always known about, that you wanted to do it? Does it come along later? Kind of what your own interpretations of this is. I'd be curious to know what led you to choose this quote.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for all of your support of the book. It's been incredible. And as a debut author, I really appreciate it. Word of mouth and just natural spreading of a book you enjoy is like the best thing you could ask for. So you've been awesome, and
Of
I
course.
really, really appreciate everything. And I'm happy to be here. Yeah, no, I that epigraph. So that's a quote from a Paris Review interview that James Baldwin did way long ago, and I don't remember where I found it. It was probably like 2013, 24. It was like really early on in the process of writing the book, before I even knew this premise that's currently, its current form, but it was actually going to come together. And the quote just stuck out to me, and it's something that like I kind of saved, and I think I even put it on like my Instagram at the time. That was like one of
Mm.
the Instagram posts had like 5 followers, and everyone was like, "What is it?" It was like a weird thing to put. People weren't really doing quotes and stuff yet. It was more like just photos at that point. Um, and it just resonated with me so deeply. And I don't even think I really understood why at that point because I was still quite young. Um, but now I think part of what it resonated with me, why it resonated with me is because at the time, again, in 2014, 2013, I was just graduating college, Cornell, working in New York Times a little bit. I had crossed over recently to some of these like elite spaces from my upbringing in the Bronx and had won some scholarships and gotten this sort of attention from these like elite institutions. And I guess through those interactions, while it was great and it was funding and it was like support that I needed and that I appreciated, there was also kind of this sense of like, I don't know, like you really you need this help, otherwise like you
Mhm.
wouldn't be able to do it without this, or like I don't know, like this is like this aura, these mannerisms, something about it just kind of felt weird to me, where I was being treated almost like like the image that always came to my mind was like when you go to the fair or something, or like the arcade, there's like that little claw that comes down and like picks up the toy, and like
Yep.
I felt like that's how I was being treated, like we picked you up and saved you out of here, so like,
Mhm.
and it was a weird feeling because I didn't grow up feeling that I was like a victim of anything really, like I think in in my neighborhood, there was things that I had, that were unfortunate or like maybe stacked against me in certain ways, but then I would look around me and like I would think I had it actually quite good. Like I had an understanding of like my relative privilege at that point. I was just like, people have it worse.
Right.
And it was, and I also didn't ever frame myself as like, I need this help, otherwise I can't, I won't make it. It was more like, this is just gonna help me out. But like if I don't get it, I'm gonna go get it another way. You know what I mean? Like that was more
Mm.
my mentality. And so I guess reading that quote and seeing that Baldwin during his time, was also feeling this way, and on a whole greater scale, because he was like the Black author, one of the only at the time who was being considered at all, and in these spaces. It was just an interesting parallel. I was like, okay, like there's something in the air. This is, it's just resonated with me. And the process of actually choosing it, funny, because I didn't really have an epigraph. I was like racking my mind for one, and my editor read that interview at some point, and she was like, "This part is so interesting." And then it was like, "Oh yeah," like it reminded me of that quote that I already encountered previously, and made me realize, like, this would actually be a perfect epigraph for the book, right? Because it had changed so many times up until that point that I think I had it considered as an epigraph at one point, and then it was like morphing, and I had like some rap lyrics in there. I had like so many different like, and then I was like, no, this is the perfect one for the book. So that it was kind of serendipitous. It was also like a sign that my editor and I were really on the right page, to the same page together working on this. So it was pretty great.
Yeah, I really think it hits the nail on the head of exactly the tone of the book and kind of like the overall message or the
Yeah.
journey that Javi takes. So it really is such a perfect one. And speaking of Javi, we can
Yeah.
get into him. What a guy. He is quite the character. And
Right.
it was interesting because there were quite a lot of mixed opinions on whether or not Javi we viewed him as likable or not.
Mhm.
I think it's very easy to say he's unlikable because obviously the things he does, and kind of how he views his actions. But a lot of people in book club during our discussion actually kind of said that they viewed him as very likable. So,
Mm.
including myself. So I'm curious as to how you saw Javi while you were writing him. Did you have any intentions or thoughts about how he would be perceived by others? And in general, kind of how you feel about the narrative and kind of the negative connotation around unlikable characters. I feel like so many times when I'm reading a review or a story, it's almost included as like a trigger warning. Oh, just so you know, this character is
Yeah, right.
unlikable, as if that takes away from the story or
Right.
the journey. So I'm just curious what your thoughts on about Javi being unlikable or not.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm so happy to hear those mixed reactions. I've heard that from readers too, and I love it, to be honest. Like,
Mm,
I think Javi, he had such a journey. When I first started him, which was, back in 2012, 2013, it was really based a lot more on me. And because of that, I was afraid to make him unlikable. I was afraid to do anything that made him seem out of pocket, or like that was going to ruffle any feathers or say anything wrong or anything like that. And he was super boring because of that. He just was super boring. Like every workshop I was in, people would be like, "Oh, we love Geo, we love like the mom." And Anais was developed; she's interesting, and everyone's like, "Oh, he's such like a punk, like he doesn't do anything, doesn't say anything. He's so safe."
mm,
And it was because I was keeping him safe. I didn't want to expose him. I didn't want to like let him free, but let him become his own character, right? And because I was just worried about what people might think about me. And then when I got a little older, I worked on this book for 10 years. So I just matured as I was writing. Um, when I let him go and just to let him be his own person, it just took off. His like all these little like angles and threads about him that I hadn't really seen before. I can start to pull at them and just take them as far as I could. And I think in terms of him being unlikable or likable, for me, I wanted him to seem like real and complex. Like my favorite fiction, a lot of it is from 90s, 80s, 70s, like earlier, when I think this like idea about likable, unlikable maybe wasn't as strong. I think as we've entered the 2010s and 2015s, we've gotten a little bit more like PC, and everyone wants to play it cool. We don't want to like hurt anybody's feelings, and I feel like I've read that in a lot of contemporary fiction where the stories are great, and not everybody, but there's books that I encounter where the stories are great and the premise is awesome and everything, but like the character, I'm just like, I could feel the writer like, pulling them back, just, oh, just like, go all the way. And that, when I finally landed on this version of the novel and I kind of like forgot about whatever I cared about, stopped caring about what would happen when I published it or like what the reaction would be, just focus on writing the best version of the book I could. I try to push Javi as much as I could, but also give him some real redeeming qualities as well, right? And so like I think that's a big part of the reason why I wanted the readers to kind of see his growth and progression. If I started the novel, he's already just like making stuff up, and like at that point, I don't think you would really empathize with him. But when you see where he comes from and how he was shaped, and also how he has, he's a good son, he's a good friend, he's not like a total terrible person. He just like really believes that this is the best way to get where he wants to be, and also believes in some way that like this is the only way, this is his only path, is to give these like institutions what they're kind of asking for. And he doesn't see himself as like manipulating. He's just like, I'm smart enough to understand that I'm gonna get,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, like I, I guess I love that people say that he's unlikable or he is like, there is that debate. Like I that's what I want, like, because I think those kind of characters stick in your head a little longer. They make you understand like who are these people, right? And wrap your head around them. If it's just like cut and dry, it might be a nice page turn and you kind of forget about it. And I really wanted to write something that people would remember and maybe talk about, and hopefully, open a door a little bit and further things would come. You know what I mean? Like really try to.
Mm-hmm.
I had grand ambitions, so I figured I need like a character who's going to be able to stand that up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I just even did a poll while you're speaking, and I had 83% said they don't think he's unlikable. So
Oh,
it's
great.
funny. So it's funny that someone could still do all the
Yeah.
things that he does, and people still don't hate him,
Yeah.
or think that bad of him. So I thought that was really interesting. Um, and then another thing, so this goes now onto about being unreliable.
Yeah.
So when I initially finished reading the book, I actually didn't even really have any thoughts about whether or not Javi was unreliable or not. And it actually wasn't until your book event in Brooklyn, where the author of Olga Dice Dreaming, she just spoke about Javi as him just being unreliable. And
Mhm.
also it was brought up in our book club conversation as well. And I think the strongest case is, since it is told through a memoir, and even
Mhm.
though there are a lot of moments where he has accountability for what he's done, no one is the perfect truth teller of their own experience. So, you can't always believe everything that someone says is that's the actual way that things went down. So I'm curious if, as well, in the same thought, if you yourself viewed him while you're writing him, or had thoughts or feelings that how people perceive him during the writing process, with their trust what he was saying, or whether they would still have some pushback on Javi being reliable.
Yeah, I when I landed on the memoir structure, I thought it was perfect because I I thought that it would challenge the reader to decide for themselves, like how much of this do they believe, right? He's allegedly telling you the true story of how this happened, right? But you
Hmm.
also know by the end, and sort of at the beginning too, that he's already fallen from grace. So he, like there is a motivation for him to spin it a certain way just to kind of cover his ass, right? To make
Right.
sure that he's looking the best that he could in the situation. But at the same time, you could also read it as he spent his career writing these stories that he really didn't believe in, or that he thought that he was just doing to get to the next story, and that real story that he was kind of afraid to write and wasn't ready to do. This The other side of it is that this is his real story, right? This is him attempting to finally write the real thing, as complicated, as nuanced as he wanted to do it, right? And I like that tension, right? So as the reader, you're reading it, and you maybe you like him, maybe you don't, maybe you agree with things he's saying, you don't, what he did. But then you also have to think like, is this really how it went, or like it just added another layer. And yeah, I don't know. Like I enjoy challenging readers. I enjoy having these multiple layers at work, because I think that it makes for a more engaging like reading experience. You know, you're doing work on different levels. And to be honest, you know, I just tried to trust myself as much as I could to think like, okay, I'm not gonna go too far with him, or like, you know what I mean? Because there was still real heart at the center of what I was trying to write. You know, I was trying to not only show this kid's journey, but also the various forces coming at him and why he made the choices he did. This friendship with his friend and how they grew apart and came back together. The relationship with his mom. Like I had a lot of other things in the constellation that I was working with, and I just try to trust myself that like I knew he might turn off some people, right? And I kind of had that as a given. I was like, oh, some people are just not going to really like this. But you know, a lot of it was just hope that people would or understand him, even if they didn't like him, they would understand him by the end. That's what I was really going for. So it's so cool to see that like, you know, the 80% actually did like him. That's great, you know, because yeah, I was, you know, when you're writing a book and before it comes out and readers read it, it's really like this gamble, right? You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, are they gonna like it? Are they not? You know, they're gonna fuck with this guy? Are they not? You know, like, and I try to do it the best that I could, make him as complex as I could, but also redeeming as possible, so that, you know, hopefully the gamble paid off. And yeah.
Yeah, I just did another poll about whether or not do people think Javi was a reliable narrator. So it wasn't as high as last time.
Yeah.
This time it was more 67% didn't
Right.
think he was reliable.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was interesting because it didn't even, that's probably a good character flaw that I didn't even think to question whether or not he
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
lying to me. But another thing, speaking on the idea of how the book was structured, you wrote the story as Javi's memoir. So I'm curious as to when it could have been explored, you know, in many different ways. So I'm curious as to, did you always know you wanted to shape it in that way? What was your intention behind shaping it as a memoir? Because I thought really when it came to the ending that was so clever, and I didn't even pick up on it, even though it was told, even though Javi interjects throughout. I never even thought that it would be a memoir, but some people in the group did click on that. So I'm curious as to how you decided to come about that structure.
Yeah, you know, it's funny when I do these interviews, I wish I had like, you know, it was on April 3rd, like like I don't remember the day. I just know that as the you know, when I landed on the idea of the book, which was like early 2020, when I finally was like, okay, I think this is the way I want to go. Um, I wrote it as a straight book, kind of. I actually wrote it each chapter as like its own individual story first, and then I tried to connect the different stories. And then there was a version of it that was just kind of like told, you know, first person. Um, and it wasn't bad, but it was like I couldn't step back as in the novel at all, because I'm writing it so close to his experience. And I realized it was kind of missing that, you know.
Mm.
Um, and I think part of what motivated me was I read, and you were in the Brooklyn event, so we kind of talked about this guy, Jason Blair,
Yeah.
from the New York Times, who was a Black New York Times reporter who became a star reporter and then kind of got taken down because, you know, he actually was making up a lot of things and he had a lot of pressure on him, and very complicated person. And anyway, I read his memoir during the drafting process, and the tone of his memoir, you know, was so interesting because he was like Javi, he was somebody who was cast out already. He already knew that people were going to read this book and not really believe him or take him serious, but he was like, I'm still going to just try to explain to you why I did what I did, you know. And the tone was so interesting that I started messing around with that. What if Javi was like 4 or 5 years, you know, whatever, years removed from what happened to him? How would his voice sound? What would that sound like? And I started just riffing on that. And out of that came the beginning and the end, this like little rant that he has, right? And then I love that so much. I was like, this is good, you know. So then I started trying to layer it. And you know, and then I realized like the book could just be his memoir, you know, that could be it. And then, you know, what I wanted to do though was not make it like it's interesting to hear that you didn't even realize it was his memoir until later,
Hmm.
which I'm happy to hear, because I didn't want it to be like too overt. Like, you know, I wanted it to be there, but like you had to like kind of pick up on it, right? I didn't want him to interject too much. Like a lot of the editing that I did with Cara Riley at Doubleday was working on those interjections and making sure they didn't come in too often and didn't like disrupt the flow of the narrative too much, but were there just enough to like remind you, like, hey, I'm telling the story, like, hey, this is, I already know how this goes, and I'm telling you the truth, maybe, you know. Uh,
Hmm.
so yeah, it was something that once I landed on that idea, it took what I thought was already like a decent, like a good book. I think it just made it a lot better, and it gave it the depth that I was searching for. And when I finished that draft, I was like, okay, this is what it's supposed to be. Yeah.
No, yeah, it didn't click it because I read a bunch of different books where the person, interjects throughout. So, but it was always just because they're leading up to some
Mm-hmm.
event and then they're kind of reflecting backward. So I didn't realize or think that, there could be us reading another book of another book type of at play. But yeah, I loved it. And then I think we briefly might have mentioned Geo, but
Yeah.
I watched and listened to a bunch of your podcasts. So I already knew that you started off as Geo, but when I mentioned it in the book club, everyone was so shocked by that, and they really were very curious about the switch that happened when you started writing as Geo to Javi. So,
Mm-hmm.
if you could tell us more about how that switch happened, because Geo was probably one of the most favorite characters
Yeah.
outside
Yeah.
the mom as well.
Yeah. That's so good to hear. Yeah, I love Geo. And Geo, I think, Geo came early, and Geo was somebody that even back in college in my little short stories that I submitting, people always loved him, and when I did workshops, they were always like, oh, this character's great, we love this guy. And so at some point I was like, maybe he's the guy, like maybe everyone likes him, maybe it's his story. And I wrote like most of my thesis in MFA school was a version of the book where he's the main character kind of. And it just like it didn't work because Geo is based off of friends that I had growing up, right? And a little bit of myself as well, but like I didn't have as much, they were friends. I didn't have as much interiority into their lives. I knew what I would know as a friend, right? And even though we were close friends, there were things that like it was hard for me, even when I tried to imagine into their minds, like it didn't feel like real enough. It didn't feel authentic enough. Um and I don't know, as soon as I like maybe took the focus off of Javi and focused on Geo, I started to realize that like there were things about Javi that I could play up to play them off of each other a little bit better. And and to also make Geo, part of what I wanted to do was I want to make Geo complicated as well, but I wanted him to be a redeeming character. I thought it would be more interesting if he's the one like who kind of does everything wrong, goes to prison, gets out of prison, but he ends up being the most level-headed, like clear of mind person out of all the young people in the novel, right? He kind of knows who he is, even if he's done maybe not made the greatest choices. Like he's owning up to them, and he's just like he's trying to fix things in his own way. And I love that. And so part of it was also like I didn't want Gio to do all the things that Javi did, right? Like it was more interesting to me to have someone like Javi go through the traditional education and scale up all the like traditional class ranks and everything, and be the one who actually needs the saving at the end, and Gio to do it. I just like that structure. But yeah, he's somebody that I've just always loved him as a character, and he just like his voice just came off the page like right away. I didn't have to do a whole lot to make Gio come to life. He was just there. And yeah.
Yeah, he was such a great contrast to Javi. And so yeah, I loved all the scenes that he was in. And I'm not sure if you can also see the Q&A chat, but we already have a couple of really
Okay.
great detailed questions. So there's one that I also was really I had Melissa talk about as well. So I'll just read what Chelsea said.
Sure.
So I love the way the book tackles wokenism and the perils of weaponizing it for personal gain. Can you
Mhm.
talk a bit more about the role of the counselor, the college diversity org, meeting Anais, and being in a college experience for Javi was essentially embarking in a new space that he had no prior exposure to? Why did you intentionally choose these moments to be the moments that launched his villain origin story?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that in those spaces, it's where, you know, Javi is really getting his first attempt at like shaping an identity for himself in a way that's like catering to the interests of others who are not from where he's from, right? When he's back home, people already know him. Like everyone, the Gio knows who he is. His mom knows who he is. Like people know him, and it's like, you know, and you see it when he comes back home and tries to use some of these words and like tries to use these lenses, and it doesn't really click up for him because it's like they're not the same environment. But he gets into this new environment, realizes that people are looking at him in a certain way, and as somebody who's starving for attention and for validation, he sees a path for himself to get what he wants, which is more attention, more validation, eventually more opportunities. And so I wanted, you know, I chose those grounds to be the place where he's really developing this identity and understanding how to craft it and lean into it, because I don't think that would have really happened back home in the Bronx. I think people would have called him out. They would have called him fake. They would have been like, you know, he might have even stumbled on that idea, right? Because nobody really talks about themselves in the way that these like academic elitist places talk about him and his community. And so that was like a perfect way to contrast that. And I think, you know, it was a lot of that was based off of my experience, again, going to Cornell and encountering that, right? And you know, we were literally in some classes like studying the places that my communities, right? And these stats and these like, you know, and these terms that were being like used to describe us. And it was all interesting, and it was like helpful for me to learn deeper about systemic issues that are real. But there was also this element of like, I don't know, we were talked about a lot of times as like we were just these like damaged goods, you know, like
Mhm.
no saving us, like, or we saving, right? I don't know. It was just like a weird setup, and it was like weird to be talking about that in these like really white spaces, in these really elite, where, you know, everyone's paying 70 grand to go, and then I'm from it, but I feel like I infiltrated this space, and now it was like getting these messages and then going home and not seeing what I saw. It was just a mind fuck. And so I wanted to try to tease out some of that. And I think it's something that a lot of people of color, particularly who go to these institutions, end up experiencing a lot of times, whether or not, even, you know, on a certain level, if you're from a certain class background, maybe more, but even if you're wealthier, you know, so I wanted to play with all that. And I remember your review, you know, mentioning that, saying how it's like you went to a school as well, similar, and how that
Mhm.
made you think about your experience. So like, I love hearing that, because like it's something that when I get around friends who went to these kinds of school, we always talk like, that was kind of weird, right? But there's not like there's not like language around it. And I was trying to put some like language and narrative, like what does that actually look like, you know, for the kid on the other side of that thing.
Yeah, no, it's funny. So one of she's in book club. She couldn't make it today, but she texted me when she got to the college, and she was like, I realized I've never had an original experience in my life, because that's how well the college scene was. And we went to the same college together. We went to Boston College. She was 2 years
Okay.
younger than me, but we were also in like the multicultural group. Like, so
Right.
there
Right.
was, so we literally have had and been a part of those conversations where people are
Yeah.
going around speaking about it. And one thing that you said that also leads into another question we got from the
Sure.
chat is this idea of that, how, which is a benefit to college as well, is that when you go there, you really can decide how you want to be shown and how
Yeah.
you want people to perceive you, because no one really knows your history and knows how you are at home. And then so one of the questions also wants to know more about the paradox of Anais's background from her family and her
Mm-hmm.
at-home experience, and how she portrayed herself in college. She loved that she really helped illuminate the class divide between her and Javi. And
Mm-hmm.
what other takeaways did you want us to glean from their relationship and her character specifically?
Yeah, yeah. Anais was also somebody I spent a lot of time trying to work on and make sure she felt real and rounded. And I think with her, you know, a lot of it was teasing out these how these class differences play out in the real world, right? And how somebody who, like you said, when you come to campus, you can become whoever you want, right? And Javi became who he wanted to be. I mean, he's also was like kind of cosplaying, become this new person as well in a certain way, right? Um, and just kind of pitting those two like new identities against each other and how they fall away when they actually live together they leave that college space and they go to New York City and they have to pay bills and they have to like pay rent and work, take the train, and like they're just living real life. And you see that a lot of her ideals that she's will be happy to scream about on a place like a college campus, in the real world, it's a lot more complicated. A lot of these issues are a lot more complicated. A lot of the, her wants and needs that she believes that she has, like in the real life practice, it's like they don't, and so trying to tease all that out. And it's the same thing for Javi as well, because he also has his own issues. Like he's writing for these, gentrifying, like hipstery kind of people in Brooklyn and whatever, and like that's the audience, but he's also doesn't want to be around them, doesn't want to confront them, doesn't want to even be seen, be known as as the writer of these stories, and that, so he has his own issues as well, even though he's kind of pining for their attention. And I think with Anais, yeah, the class thing was a big one, but also the idea of, when you're advocating for issues, like it's easy sometimes for people to be anointed as the speaker for everybody, but not, they don't always have like the best intentions for everybody in mind, right? And it's almost hard to be a speaker for anybody, to be a speaker for a large group of people, because everyone has their own things that they're really considering and going for. No one's kind of perfect. And so Anais, even though she is this like campus leader and says all these things, like she goes back to New York and doesn't want to be around the sort of community that she's like supposedly advocating for, right? So it allowed me to get at contradictions. Like I really wanted to highlight people's contradictions, all of our contradictions, I think. Not, I wasn't trying to set myself up as like perfect or anything, but just, even though we can advocate for certain ideals in practice, they're really messy to implement. And that push and pull to me is such a fertile ground for fiction to explore, not necessarily to offer up answers, but just like highlight that, and see what people like have to say about it. Who do they side with? Like, what do they take away from it?
Yeah, that was another big topic when we had our in-person discussion. And it was kind of one of those things where we were joking around saying, well, what's wrong with wanting, a building with the doorman,
Yeah,
or what's wrong with,
right.
wanting almond milk in your coffee, whatever. But, and it's like, and it's not inherently wrong, but, say if you do want a building with a doorman, and say those are in certain neighborhoods, you have to be honest about what that is also costing, in the large
Mhm.
scheme, and what role that plays in gentrification as well. So it's just one of those things where it was a fun thing to have to talk about and debate, because we all know a version of her, or we've met a version of her in our
Yeah,
lives.
yeah. I
So
hear that all the time. And it was like, I know the
yeah.
version again.
And another question from the chat as well was, and I know a lot, the book was compared a lot to either Yellowface, American Fiction.
Yeah.
Yellowface, I had pushback on, which I think I might have told you about, but specific questions about American Fiction, and just, did you see any parallels to that film more thematically? And like, what
Yeah.
were your thoughts in general of the film if you watched it?
Yeah, I actually really enjoyed the film. And I think thematically it's getting at a lot of similar issues, particularly the parts that are about commenting about the media industry and like the tokenization and sort of the selling your story, for a certain audience to make it. I think where it differs is the perspective. Like Javi is not, from an upper middle class, like professor sort of view. He's like this kid from the bottom, and he's like very much more like he's leaning in where Monk, the protagonist in American Fiction, is. He's not all the way. He's like very reticent. He's doing it first as a joke, as a troll, and then it kind of takes off, and he decides to go with it. But Javi's like all the way in from the beginning. He's like, no, I see where this is going. This is where I want to go. And so there's like a fundamental difference in perspective, I think. And then there's also the friendship aspect with Geo, and sort of these like class jumping things that I'm trying to get at as well. But I think why I enjoyed the film, and I actually wrote about this for an essay that's coming out pretty soon, I think, with Public Books, is about I enjoy that there was like real heart to the story as well. To me, some of the most memorable scenes of the movie are not when he's like talking to his publisher or like doing the whole gambit or whatever. It's like him and his mom and his brother, and the relation, the family, like this turbulent family dynamic and relationship that he's trying to repair or figure out. To me, that was some of the more interesting parts of the movie. And in a lot of ways, I feel like the Cord Jefferson kind of like snuck that like more interesting part into this like Trojan horse that
Hmm.
could get made. And so yeah, I loved it. And it was so cool to like see it come around at the same time as the book. Obviously I had no idea that it was, by the time that I heard about the movie, my book was done. By the time Yellowface came out, my book was done too. So it was like, it was interesting that all these things were like in the ether. Everyone, these creators were all kind of thinking about the same things at the same time. And it's been like a little bubble to be part of. So that's been interesting.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I think, in all honesty, I probably got your arc around the same time that I was reading Yellowface. So yeah, it's interesting how, the timing of everything worked
Mm-hmm.
out and overlapped. And I honestly think about, timing a lot. So we also spoke about it in book club, and around the time period of the conversations the book is really speaking to, where diversity and inclusion was at its peak,
Yeah.
where Twitter really was such a hub and it had the power to influence in positive ways and in negative ways, as we've seen with Javi, where people are being
Yeah.
canceled left and right because of their tweets and so forth. So I'm curious if, like, during the writing process, how you felt about how it would be perceived, now that we're years after. I think that the book came at a really great time because I have some pushback on the idea that of how willingly people can really be honest about things if it's in the moment. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
think that, of course, like in the moment, that is when things happen, but I think having distance from it is what allows us to be more honest and like critical and see that gray area and like how we contribute to things now that we've had some time past it. So I'm curious if timing at all came about in your conversations, and how you thought about it when when you're writing it, and then, now that the book is out.
Yeah. Fiction is just slow. Like,
Hmm.
like writing it is slow. Like a lot of when these conversations were popping off, like I was just processing. I didn't really have my thoughts fully formed. I didn't have perspective yet. That takes time to develop. And I think that if I would have try to publish it in that moment, let's say, whatever I was thinking at that time, it would have been uneven. It wouldn't have been as, you know, it wouldn't have been the book that I want that I'm proud of today, right? I think that book needed time to sit and marinate and think about things. So I also don't think it would have got made, to be honest, at that point. I think we weren't
No.
ready to have these conversations, right? Like we collectively as a society needed distance. We were all going through it, and everybody's just seeing it. It was a really big paradigm shift and the power shift and imbalance. And social media had never really been used in this way before. It was still fairly new, right? So I think it needed that kind of simmering. I know I did as the writer. And then the other part of it too is that not only just writing fiction is slow, the publishing industry is slow,
Hmm.
right? Like the book was done in 2022, but takes a while
Right.
to do the edits and the cover and everything, so all that to say, I think it's almost impossible to try to write about an issue while it's happening. You're always going to be late, no matter what, right?
Mm.
It's just, I mean, I guess if you like self-publish it, maybe, but then less people are going to read it, most likely, and um, so for me, I tried not to like when I was writing, I didn't think like, oh, I'm gonna be the first person to talk about this, or like I'm gonna hop on this wave while it's hot or anything like that. It was more like I was noticing all these things and realizing that there was an opportunity for someone like Javi to capitalize. And what would that look like? I was more fundamentally interested, like, what would that story look like? Because I hadn't seen that. I wasn't necessarily trying to. There'd been a lot of novels who've written about online culture and like cancellations and things like that. And I've read some of them, but one of the things that like left me wanting more was that the main character, especially if they were a person of color, were always kind of like acted upon, right? They were the ones that you were supposed to feel the worst for, or like they were taken for a grift, or why is this happening to me? I was like, I would love a character who is in the driver's seat, like they're the ones making the choices. They're the ones with the agency. They're the ones like doing some of the quote unquote bad. So they're leaning into this. Like we all know that there's these doors open for us. Some people are leaning into it. Like why, where's this? I would love to see stories. What does that look like and why they would do that? So I just kind of focus more on that than trying to write about the moment. And of course the moment is wrapped up into it. But to me, that's not the greater like purpose of the book. There's other books you could read to learn more about that than mine. I don't really have, there's not a lot of tweets or like emojis or like Slack stuff in there. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
novels you can read about for that if that's what you're looking for. It's more about the psyche of this guy and like why he would do something like this and the messages he's getting from the world and like how he's reacting to it.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, that's exactly kind of why. I mean, we read also Yellowface for book club, and to be honest,
Mm-hmm.
it was probably like the shortest conversation we've ever had to this date. Only because it was the fact that when you have, like, to me, it's set up as where it's just a clear, obvious wrong, where you
Right.
have like a white person pretending to be a person of
Right.
color. So
Right.
automatically, what's more to discuss? It's
Yeah.
just like the plot was really fun and engaging, but in terms of like being able to have like nuanced conversation where there isn't that much to say, like from the first chapter, like you knew the character was wrong, whereas here there was a lot of gray area to be able to, and it's not always so black and white.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I think, was really great and separates the two. But another thing that I've noticed that has come up in your interviews and was also mentioned in book club was, how would this story be perceived if it
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote got into the wrong hands? And
Right.
I
Right.
just took that as, someone who either would take this fictionalized story and weaponize it to either
Mm-hmm.
justify or, affirm the idea that, that they're minority stories that are not legitimate or that they're dramatized. And I think I remember your response being something along the lines of like that it's out of your control, and
Yeah.
which I do agree with. And another person in book club, when that was brought up, responded to it actually with this argument around reading comprehension. And
Mm-hmm.
it's funny because like it recently came up on TikTok while I was cracking these questions, and they go into explain it further, where it's how, and it's really relevant to the specific time that we're in, is that reading comprehension includes the ability to infer the intended audience that the author is talking about without having the author telling you directly who they think the
Right.
audience is. So we have to, as readers, figure out on our own whether or not, we're that audience or who the audience is. So if the reader can't do that, then it means they lack reading comprehension skills, which I think it's like really evident in the time, because obviously not everything is for everyone. And,
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of people who read certain books or movies or text and they just miss the joke, they miss the context, it just goes
Yeah.
completely
Yeah.
over their heads. And there was this thing on TikTok where I'm not sure if it was going around this thing. It's called this bean soup debacle, where there was this girl who posted a recipe about bean soup and had like 15 different beans. And it was just like, it's clearly a bean soup. And the first comment was like, well, what if I don't like beans? And it's just like, okay, well, obviously you just don't have the recipe and you move on and you read or eat something else. So I'm curious because, Victim is satire, and
Mm-hmm.
satire is not for everyone. There are people who
Yeah.
read who either miss the joke, or don't have the context or the understanding of why that joke has the meaning it does. And in your interview on the Stacks podcast, you also mentioned how satire involves like a wink and a nod to the audience about it, who has to be in on it. So I'm curious, my question is, during your writing process, when you decided for it to be satire, was it ever a concern for you that people might not understand the humor and nuance around it? I know it's not literally on a rant about reading comprehension. I'm not going to ask you who you think the target audience is, but I am curious if maybe you
Yeah.
saw any similarities in the readers who appreciate the story the most, and kind of what your thoughts are about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. No, I mean, um, I think for me, I just tried to like, I wanted to first write the best book that I thought I could on this subject and how, like, Andrew's version of it, what would that look like that I feel like was missing, right? And, you know, I guess I considered that some people wouldn't get it, maybe, or not understand it. There's a lot of slang. There's a lot of I've heard people say there's too much Spanish. The first chapter, I was like, I can't read it. There's too much Spanish. And I'm like,
Mm,
well, it's not for you, right? Like, so like for me, I was just kind of like, there's gonna be things about this book that's gonna make it not for certain people, and I was just okay with live with that because I thought that the version that I wanted to write was important and good and like would add to the conversation. But I also knew that fundamentally it would be a more challenging experience. You know, it's not the kind of book that you're gonna read and be like, well, that was pleasant, and then close it and walk away, right? You're gonna be like, oh, you know, you're gonna have thoughts and questions and you know, and maybe you loved it, maybe you kind of liked it, there's certain parts that made you icky, you know, and I've heard all these responses in between. And and I just kind of, you know, again, it's a gamble when you're writing a novel. Like I hope that gamble paid off enough people would understand it and understand where I'm coming from. You know, I think especially if, you know, to me it's not that hard. Like, I mean, the book has an epigraph from James Baldwin. You know, you see where I come from, the things I've written about. Like, I think you could deduce pretty simply, easily, like where I'm coming from with these conversations and who I'm trying to talk to, and you know, and I think, but at the same time, I didn't want it to be that like heavy-handed, like you don't get to like it, and you get to like it, and you get to, you know, like, because that to me is not literature either. Literature is like, I don't know who's going to turn around and pick up this book and open it. And if I try to write to please everybody, I'm going to please nobody. Right. And if I try to, you know, like, so I got to try to, you know, first off, I was trying to please myself. Is this meet my bar? Right. And then second, you know, close friends, like people I trust, my wife, like people who know me. I'm like, you know, this holds up. This okay. Like, you know, you know, what do you think? And people saw me in it. They saw these conversations that we're all having, and you know, and at that point, I was like, well, whatever happens, happens. You know, like to me, like as an artist, like I can't write with all these people in my head because it's gonna suck. Like it's just not gonna, you know, I'm not gonna like it because I'm gonna be trying to please. There's too many readers to please, and you can't possibly do it. So I just made a decision at some point, like I'm not gonna try to please everybody, and hope that there's going to be the people who it's supposed to reach is going to reach. And I, you know, when I see reviews like yours, when I see, you know, I read the Goodreads, people are like, oh, you read the Goodreads, but I read them and I see that, like, you know, there are people that is reaching, that are getting the things out of it that I would hope that they got, and even more than I even imagined. And then there's people who like don't, you know, they don't like it. They think it's shallow, or they think it's like playing with issues that I shouldn't play with, and you know, that's what can I do? You know.
Yeah, no, I think about the concept of relatability a lot, especially when you're talking about like more personal experiences. And I think it's almost funny because there's so much diversity and the people go through in their personalities. So it's kind of crazy to force a writer to write as if people are a single blob. Like even like, so my
Right. Yeah.
favorite, yeah, so my favorite aspects of the book, you know, were, you know, very specific things that happen in college where it's like, unless you went to like a liberal arts school that's predominantly white and you're also involved in, you know, the culture group, then you're not gonna have that experience.
Right.
But those inclusions are what, since they're so specific, those are why I really enjoy that. And because it's refreshing, because you're not going to hear about that with all these characters. So it's funny because relatability is kind of like, no, nothing's really going to be that relatable if you're trying to keep it in terms of how
Exactly.
the masses would perceive
Exactly.
it. Yeah. So another thing that was brought up, which I was very curious to get your thoughts on as we're wrapping up, is that the format of the book being Javi's memoir and the way that it was told, one of our members, you know, viewed it as, you know, this actually, even at running, being a memoir is actually just a further example of Javi victimizing himself. But I thought was interesting because I didn't have that exact perception. So, and it kind of made me, and we started talking about the scenarios where you have real people who you brought up who have either been canceled and then now they go and get a big deal for a memoir, and
Right.
then
Right.
or they go and make this like really cryptic YouTube video explaining their story that gets, you know, so many views and so much money and stuff. And even though, you know, the memoir can humanize people and you do see him again take accountability, I'm curious how you view the take about, you know, the whole thing is still just another example of
Yeah.
Javi playing a victim, and kind of what your thoughts are, if that surprises you at all or anything along those lines.
No, I love that. I love that takeaway. You know, I think again, like for me, I'm like at the end, I'm hoping to throw up all these possibilities in the air, and it's like there's no like, you know, single wrap up like with a bow. It's like you have to figure you know, what was he really doing here? Was he really trying, was he doing a little bit of both? Was he, you know, or was he, yeah, is he trying to sell his story again, right? And he has that, he kind of has a moment at the end with Gio where they're having this conversation where it's like, you know, he's conflicted. Like his agent reached out, he's telling him that he has his opportunities now again because people, it's been enough time that they want to hear from him. They give him a book deal. It's the same thing all over again. And he's kind of like, he's gone in this whole different path and, you know, put his phone aside and try to focus on himself and be better. And now it's like, do I step back in? You know, do I go play the game again? And is it possible to play the game in a way that like I still retain who I am and like these things that I've learned? And so, you know, I try to tease out that he's conflicted about that as well. He's not just like, oh, my agent's calling me, like awesome, like I'm back on. You know, it's more like, should I do this? And you know, I wanted to leave it open ended like that to have people to sort of decide for themselves. Do you think this is a genuine thing he's doing? Is he just trying to jump on it again, or is it a bit of both? And if it is a bit of both, is that bad, right? Like, is he, you know, he still loves writing. He's still writing this journal. He's still writing. He's, you know, he is a writer. And if this is his way back in, but he can do it in a way that he believes is now the correct way. Is that okay, right? And so yeah, I think that's a really great question to think about as a reader, and one that, you know, I was sort of like teasing out, like how much of this guy do you really trust and believe? You know, that's something that each reader has to sort of like decide for themselves.
And it's kind of interesting just to the point that you just said. And I think about, and then it came up also as well, is that can you really do anything with like pure intentions? Because everything is kind of an exchange for another. Like, even
Right.
if like you're on a news platform and say like they're showing a really great story and say it was structured all very well, that platform still gets money because they're getting views for it. Like, so it's still, it's almost like, is it a bit unrealistic to think that there could be scenarios where there isn't something at play where someone gains
Mm-hmm.
something,
Mm-hmm.
not just like out of the goodness of their heart or anything along those lines. So I think it's interesting to think about. So another question that we'll have before we wrap up is,
Sure.
the ending was also a big talking point. Now people thought it was really just really funny, and people just really had a lot of fun with it. So I'm curious, what was your thought process when you were trying to figure out, how you wanted Javi to have, some moment of where
Mm-hmm.
he'd be forced to be confronted, and be canceled? Was there anything that either inspired you in real life, or they're based on any things that maybe
Mm-hmm.
you've seen in your time as a journalist? Like, I'm just curious how you came to be on structuring that ending with Javi.
Like the interview scene.
Yeah, on
Yeah,
TV.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. You know, that was one of the first things that I had for the book when I realized what it was going to be. I just imagine, like, I would have loved to see that myself, like get one of these
Mm,
guys and like corner him and like what are they, how do they spin this in real time, right? Because a lot of this is done through social media, it's done through writing, it's done through emails. It's like you can build this persona online, and then when you bring that person from online and put them in the real world under the lights, who are they, right? And you like, and so I thought of that scene really early on, and I knew that would, I basically knew it was like, that's the ending. How do I get there? How do I get him to be big enough that he would even be on that show and have people care, right? And so I had to kind of like figure out my way there. But the ending was something that I was like, you know, I knew I wanted that, and yeah, I wanted the reader to have a chance to see him being confronted by somebody, you know, and what does that look like, and when he, also the reader to see when he's starting to realize like this audience, these like followers, these people he believes like love him so much, like how quickly they turn, and what does that feel like as well, you know? And I thought like, it's, if he had something like that, then it would justify this kind of turn that he makes at the end where he's trying to be more reflective about why he did what he did, about what does true community look like, what does true meaning in his life look like he needed to have that like crash and burn moment, and I just imagine that would be such a fun like way of doing it. But yeah, it's not really inspired. I just kind of made it up. It wasn't really inspired by
mhm.
anything, or yeah. I just, it's something I wished I could have seen, you know, like with other, you know, I guess real life figures that have done this sort of thing.
Yeah, no, it's a really funny scene where I think everyone had a lot of fun, and even listening it when I was listening to an audio, it was fun to
Yeah.
relive it because I forgot how crazy and hectic it was. But another thing, lastly, before we wrap up, is kind of that we talked about was just, kind of how you just said, it's like the idea about like how he realized and forced to confront that, all these beliefs he had about his value and worth like aren't really real, and kind of how it's like so much of what, our time now as people talk about these issues about our biggest problems are scrolling on social media, all these things that are kind of frivolous. And it's like, we had the conversation, well, if all your problems can be solved with just turning off your phone and just getting rid of it, then it's like,
Right,
how
right.
deep are those problems? So I thought, it was it was a fun way to explore some of those things that Javi went through, because all the things he cared about, it's like, well, he said, well, I was able to still get a good job and
Hmm.
still pay. Like, it's not like his livelihood was, he's still able to figure out how to support himself and
Hmm.
figure out how to keep going. He has his mom. So it all just kind of, it was a interesting reminder that like, yeah, we all kind of need like a reality check of all the things that we think are so important in real lives.
Hmm.
It's probably not that important if you have your basic, needs taken care of. But yeah. So I mean, we're at the hour mark. So I think, that was a pretty good way to end the conversation. I know I don't want to take too much of your time, but I mean, thank
Yeah.
you so much for, chatting with us today. It really is honestly like, it was one of the highest rated books we've had as a group, and it was really
I'm
so
so
much
happy to hear
fun.
that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no. And I kind of knew from the moment we read that it would be good, because so much of it, I think people, you know, we were the target audience if there was any
Yeah.
so it hit us in all the right ways, and we understood
Thank
everything.
you.
Yeah, so thank you everyone as well for tuning in and for coming with your questions. This will also be recorded as well, so once I figure out how to edit that, will be, I'll send that along. But I mean, thank you so much for your time today. I mean, I know we'll talk offline too.
Yes, we will.
But the last thing I wanted to ask you was that if there were any books, on your radar, that what you're currently reading, just like a fun wrap up, or any things you're excited about coming out anytime soon or already is out this year.
Yeah. So right now I have this book that was just sent to me from Zippy Books, Exposure, it's
Oh,
called.
interesting. Okay.
Ava Velaria. And I've read like 30 pages of it so far, but it's yeah, it's been really interesting. And you maybe blurbing it. So far it's been a good read. So that one is something I'm currently reading. I'm looking forward to Danzy Senna's novel, Colored Television, I believe it's called, which is I think in July. Um, Matteo Ascarpor, his
Yes, he has a new one coming out, The Great
his new book
Hemisphere.
coming out, Great
Yeah.
Hemisphere. There's a lot of really great books like still coming out. Oye, Melissa Mogollon, who
Oh
I've
man,
seen.
I was literally writing the review for it before we're
Yeah,
speaking.
yeah, she's awesome. We're doing an event together. I can't wait. She's super great.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of great books coming out in these next few months. And then I'm personally reading also a lot of books for like the next thing I'm working on. A lot of books about like trying to write about fatherhood, parenthood, like masculinity a little bit more as well, like a fictional story, but encapsulating these bigger themes. So I just read I think it's called Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, which is like a more of a sociological kind of study nonfiction book about young men in bed and the problems and the gaps that they're facing right now. And so I'm trying to read some books like that to just understand more about the issues myself for the thing I'm working on. But yeah, I always wish I had more time to read more things.
Yeah. No,
I'm
I mean,
slow now.
everything sounds really good. So I'm excited for that, and excited to whenever your next book,
Thank you.
comes out, obviously we'll happily be your first reader. So I can't wait for that. And obviously, yeah, we'll keep in touch. So thank you everyone for coming today. Happy Sunday, and hope you have a great rest of your day, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Letitia. You've been amazing, and I'm so grateful to have you as such a big supporter of the book. So thank you for
No,
everything you've
yeah,
done.
I told everyone we're friends now. So just like, so
We
you're
are, no,
aware.
for real,
Yeah.
we are. Yeah, we are, for sure, for sure.
All right. Have a good day.
Can we get like I love to get like a picture or something, or how do you do a screenshot of this?
Oh, that's okay. Do I have Victim?
I have one. I
Well,
brought
it's
one.
recorded. It's recorded. So if
Okay.
we
All
just
right.
pause, and then I'll
You
just
did?
make sure there's screen grab.
Okay. All
That's a
right.
screen grab.
Okay.
That was cute. Okay, I'll send it to you after.
All right. Take care. Thank you
Bye.
so much. Have a
Of
great rest
course.
of your weekend.
You too. Thank you.